Hello, everybody. Again, we have with us a great guest who's very popular in terms of the information he's sharing with us, Tim Schroeder, who's the CEO of CTI Clinical Trials. Thanks for your time with us, Tim.
You're welcome. Thanks for inviting me this morning, Kris.
So we are here sitting in the time frame of the vaccines are getting out to our community and to the world. You've got a long history in dealing with medicines, vaccinations, and things of that nature. So what is CTI again, and what role have you been playing with the COVID pandemic?
Well, coming to you this morning from balmy northern Kentucky. Over my shoulder, you can see the snow and the ice from the last day or two. But we started CTI 22 years ago. We are a clinical research organization who works on behalf of the pharmaceutical and the biotechnology and the medical device industry. Essentially, an organization like ourselves is hired by those organizations to oversee and manage the research process. So over our 20 plus years, we've been fortunate to be involved in more than 130 drug approvals that go through the process of FDA and other organizations like that around the globe. We happen to be headquartered here in Northern Kentucky, Greater Cincinnati. Got associates now in about 60 countries, so we're on all 6 continents, continue to grow quite nicely. And this time a year ago or so, we had little to no experience around COVID-19 research, but our team was able to pivot, quite successfully and quite quickly around the globe. And I think now we're part of more than 40 different research projects around COVID. So that involves developing new treatments, that involves developing new vaccines, and involves developing new testing or diagnostics to identify people that are positive. So we've been able to jump right in and make a contribution.
Well, it's been amazing the amount of work you've done and the growth of your organization. We're now looking at the availability of the vaccines we have around the world, and we know of Pfizer, we know of Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, I understand, is coming online hopefully in a matter of weeks. There's this. Speak to the issue of why there's so many vaccines available. The different organizations have been trying to build their own. How does that work, and how does that come about, and how does that differ in this situation compared to other times dealing with vaccines?
Yeah, if you think about it, Kris, I mean, we've had a really successful launch and rollout of vaccines over the last 50 or 60 years that have really revolutionized healthcare, and especially the infectious disease part of healthcare and prevention rather than treatment. Going back, in this region, all the way back to the polio vaccine with Dr. Sabin, which is 50 plus years ago. If done effectively, you can almost eradicate many diseases with vaccines, and these include both childhood vaccines and adult vaccines. And so I think when the pandemic broke a little over a year ago, a lot of the greatest scientific minds in the pharmaceutical and biotech industry said, let's take everything we have and we know, and let's develop vaccines that we think would be effective against COVID-19. Now, it's one thing to say we think we know, but it's another thing to prove it in the laboratory, and then to actually have a vaccine that you can test in humans and be able to move that into testing and through the testing in the time period they have. Not to get political or to media bash, but I don't know if the true magnitude of the story is really appreciated, that, in well under a year, we've gone from a concept to vaccines being approved through the emergency use authorization to being rolled out. And just to give you a sense, in the US, I think this week we will likely pass 40 million Americans will have received at least their first vaccine. We're now getting up to close to 2 million a day being vaccinated. And I'm really, thrilled with the progress we've made. And I'm even more optimistic with, if you look at what we're seeing is, new vaccines being likely approved in the coming weeks, more production of the existing ones. And I think for the listeners, one of the things we have to think about is we're in a particularly positive situation here in the US. It's not so positive in other places around the globe. And we do have to think about this as a global pandemic, that if we are not able to knock this down globally, then we run the risk of it, just migrating back to any of the places that have successfully either eliminated it or knocked it down. So while we've made, I think, really great progress in the US, other places around the world are behind us, and we need to make sure that, production ramps up, availability, cost does not end up being a deterrent, that we can really vaccinate everybody who needs it, globally.
There's so many different directions we can go in the discussion because of your comments there. Let's talk about the vaccine itself or the vaccines themselves as they come available. Is there a reason why anyone today, if I've had this question asked of me, do I want to make a decision on which to get? Do I want to wait till Johnson & Johnson comes out or another manufacturer, or should I get it when I can? Or should I I'm healthy, I'll just sit back and wait and not take a vaccine and see what happens down the road?
Pardon me. No, you ask a really good question. And I think that health experts around the world, including people like the FDA, the NIH, the CDC, World Health Organization, I think the recommendations today are, as soon as you become eligible, take any vaccine that is offered to you. Now, I do believe that as we gather more data and we have more long-term follow-up and we have a limitless supply of all the vaccines, that those recommendations might change. But I think that's likely to be 6 to 12 months in the future. Just to give a point of reference, is if you look at the annual flu vaccine, which is the influenza vaccine, there are different doses of that vaccine that are given. For instance, elderly get a higher dose. Usually it's a double dose than younger individuals do. And that's part of that is that their immune systems do not respond as they did when they were younger. And so I do think there might be a time in the COVID world where there are differences in the vaccines and different doses or different dosing schedules. But I think right now the message should be simple. If you have access, you should get it. And I think you should feel extremely confident after the tens of millions of doses that have been administered in a very, very short time period about the safety. And, you can go on to, one of these websites like the CDC or Johns Hopkins and things, and they'll actually show you how incredibly low the side effect profiles are on this, which, rightfully so, people were concerned about that months ago. But I think we can say now that we really have a long enough and a large enough experience to not consider that. I think right now the recommendation is everybody eligible should get vaccinated.
And to the study of the actual vaccines to begin with, which your company helps organizations with, you talked about the unprecedented speed at which this was accomplished. And I think you alluded to this. It was, obviously the U.S. obviously having the resources, scientists from around the world and the U.S. wanting to jump in and solve the issue, like Dr. Sabin, et cetera. When you think of that down the road, and as the virus mutates and changes a bit, as you said, really is like the flu as well. Is that something that you'll see a continued increase of the number of types of vaccines, or do you think the ones that will come out will basically just continually get improved and adapted, or will we just suddenly in a few years you think have 10, 12 different type of vaccines out there that are manufacturers who actually are working on this?
Yeah, it's a really good question. If you use the flu vaccine as the analogy here, there are multiple manufacturers that manufacture the influenza flu vaccine each year. And there are actually changes in that vaccine each year because the influenza vaccine does mutate or have a variant, as we've discussed, or we've read about, relative to COVID. So I think fast forwarding, likely there will be multiple manufacturers in the future. As you know, right now in the US, we have 2 that are approved, one from Pfizer and one from Moderna. You mentioned the J&J vaccine, which we anticipate that likely will get approved in March. AstraZeneca, another major pharmaceutical company, has their vaccine approved in Europe right now. And we anticipate that also will be approved in the US probably in March. And then a 5th major player that you don't hear a lot about is a company called Novavax. We also are real optimistic about that one, that we think there's a good chance in the next 6 or 8 weeks that one will be approved. So the landscape, for the first, say, 3 months of the rollout has been 2 vaccines here in the US. We think that landscape will at least double over the next, couple of months. And trying to think about what does it look like, say, a year from now or 2 years from now, I don't think it's unrealistic to think there could be a dozen or more manufacturers. We're doing work, for instance, with a San Diego-based biotechnology company called Arcturus, where we're doing work in Asia for their vaccine development, and have been since March. That has progressed very nicely. So I think there'll be multiple players in this space. And the good news is multiple players, if we end up with either a manufacturing shortage or if we end up with, some kind of hiccup, we're not dependent, on just one or two players. So I think that's really good, obviously, for us as a consumer to have multiple people, doing vaccine development.
So Tim, you're in 60 countries, which is unbelievable. Your company's growth and impact on really saving lives, which is got to be something you're proud of. When you think about this issue you referred to of making sure the entire world is vaccinated and not just more advanced countries, speak to that a bit, and the fact of how, when you look at the future, and then also how, even for those of us who would get a vaccine, how often you think we'll get them in the future?
Yeah, it's interesting, Chris. A typical day for us with a global company, obviously there's no end or beginning to the day. It's just sort of when you insert yourself into it. But, just to give you an example, yesterday, combination of conversations and meetings with our team members. Usually they start early in the day, obviously for us here in the US, with our team in Europe. And then, our Latin America and North American time zones are relatively similar. And then, our evenings, we turn our attention to what's going on in the Asia Pacific region. And even we start earlier in the Middle East, Africa, continuum. And so in some ways, it's interesting because we do as a company get a global view of things. And, for instance, I can tell you across Europe, where we have offices in more than a dozen countries, my conversations there are really different than they are, for instance, here in the US. Those employees and their families are still very much in lockdown mode, whether it's in Lisbon, Portugal, Madrid, Spain, Milan, Italy, Paris, France, London. Almost all of those places have very severe restrictions. And unfortunately, unless you happen to be a healthcare worker or somebody in a frontline situation, or an extreme elderly individual that's in an assisted living, no access to vaccines at all. So in some ways, when I hear those conversations, they're several weeks, if not months, behind us right now. And keep in mind, those are developed countries that I would say are on par with the US relative to healthcare, economics, et cetera. So when you think about that, then think of the developing world, where unfortunately, even the delivery mechanisms, there's some particular challenges around the first two vaccines, in that one of them, the Pfizer one, has to be cold stored at minus 80 degrees and is a double dose. The Moderna one is a double dose. It does allow for a little bit easier cold storage. But one of the reasons we're optimistic about some of the future ones is potentially having a bigger supply, but also having the opportunity in more remote areas, or in areas where the poverty level is such that we will have different opportunities that don't require people to, for instance, have 2-hour transportation to go get immunized, not just once, but twice, So I think all those things have to, when you think about a global rollout, we have to think about those. And, we have tended to think about things from a Western perspective, but there are some really significant happenings in both the Russian circles and the Chinese circles on their vaccines. CTI has not had a chance to test any of those. We've actually reached out, offered, and frankly wanted to be a bridge to do those. Most of those have been tested locally. So the Russian vaccine primarily in Russia, the Chinese one in China, but they are now starting to move into places like Latin America and Asia Pacific and the Middle East regions, which, obviously, as long as they're safe and have some level of efficacy, this is, part of the solution, which is, obviously a really good thing.
Absolutely. Well, and it's interesting to the issue of moving forward as the availability, the manufacturing availability goes up. What's your perception of how many will we get this vaccine annually, every couple of years? What's the recommendation on that?
I think the short answer right now, Chris, is we don't know, but the experts are planning on this being an annual vaccine. And I think they would be pleasantly surprised to not have to do that. If we got to a place where we didn't require this annually for the next few years, I think people would say, well, we planned for that and it wasn't needed, so that's a good thing. We are seeing companies come to us already with second generation studies where the vaccines have either been tweaked to accommodate for the mutations or variants that you hear about. We're also hearing companies coming to us and having discussions about testing different dosing schedules. So we're not sure at this point. As you know, the first two approved are double doses, and they appear to be extremely efficacious. But the question is, does everyone need the double dose? And is the timing of the double dose, we're not entirely sure what that timing should be. And it's not a fault of anybody. It's just early in the research process to know that. So we do anticipate likely that there will be, annual vaccinations of this. We do think that the vaccines themselves probably will subtly change year over year. We have heard companies talking to us in very preliminary fashions about combined vaccines, where maybe a COVID vaccine and an influenza vaccine could be administered together. There's all kind of challenges to do that, especially in a short time frame. But point out to your listeners and viewers, several of the, for instance, the childhood vaccines are combined. Measles, mumps, and rubella is a typical vaccine. Now, if you contrast influenza, which is an annual vaccine for the flu virus, and then you contrast that, for instance, with some other vaccines, which maybe only are administered every 5 or 10 years, we don't know at this stage. Some of it's going to depend on the longevity of the immune response in each individual over time, and we're studying that. For instance, I'm in one of the studies right now. I'm committed to a 2-year participation, so they will follow me. They will do different tests just like they do everybody else over years to see, one, what level of response did I have if I received the vaccine, and two, how long do I maintain it? So that's information that literally we gather in real time every day, every week, every month, and compile it in blinded fashions, and then we analyze it and submit it to people like the FDA, for their review.
Well, having talked with you about this topic for over the year, one thing that I really have been amazed by, Tim, is your positive outlook on the process and really where we are. Do you still hold that same positive outlook? And obviously, the industry very well. The scientists. The system behind how to bring these to market. But what's your feeling on that today?
I mean, right now, Kris, and you have to think in terms of where you and I are very local and very parochial, and then you think of you a little bit more regional, more national, and then more global. Certainly, if you look at the U.S., the statistics for the most part are very, very promising. Case rates are going down, hospitalizations are going down, death rates are going down. Those are tremendous things. Now, that doesn't mean every community is experiencing that right now, and it doesn't mean every place in the world is experiencing it. But I think in general, we're seeing really positive things. I think a second thing to go to that, and part of that, just as a point of reference, our clinicians, the physicians, the nurses, the pharmacists, the lab technicians, et cetera, they have gotten much better at managing people with this disease. So I think the good news is combination. We're vaccinating some of the most at-risk people. Our healthcare workers are better at diagnosing and treating this than they've ever been before. And I assume that they will continue to get better. We're focusing this conversation on vaccines, but I'm really thrilled that we've had a number of the treatments that we're working on that are truly showing life-saving abilities that are also moving through the FDA approval processes. So that's really encouraging. I think if anything, and I've heard this said different ways by different people, but I think that science is winning this war. It's not maybe winning it as quickly as people would like, and completely valid criticisms of we need to be better prepared for the future, and be in a situation, with a world where basically people fly all over. The days of being able to say, well, that's a disease of some jungle in Africa, or that's a disease in the Amazon, we don't have to worry about that. I think this is illustrated. We have to be concerned about disease everywhere in the world and its ability to be contagious, to be communicated, throughout the globe. So I do think, whether it's World Health Organization or CDC or NIH or FDA, I think we will be much better prepared in the future. But I do feel optimistically like this particular pandemic, we are making progress. To go back to the vaccine side of it, Israel is a really interesting model for us as a country. They're quite small, but they have rolled out the vaccine very quickly there, and they've seen really positive events, especially in the most at-risk populations like the elderly. I think there's every reason to believe we can duplicate that everywhere. I think here in the U.S., as I mentioned earlier, We go over 40 million vaccine administrations to people this week, probably. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility for us to get between 150 to 200 million, by the end of the spring. And I think when you think about immunizations and then natural immunity, basically how many of us have already had the virus and developed our own response against it? The people who talk about herd immunity, from more of a theoretical perspective, but I think when you start thinking about vaccinating 150 to 200 million Americans and having 50 million or more that have already naturally acquired immunity, I think that puts us in a really good place, by the summer, for us to be thinking about, things like, the things we're used to doing, whether that's simple things like socializing or school activities or athletic events or concerts or vacations or things like that. So I am optimistic, and I do feel like, there's always unknowns around the corner, but I think right now, we're making good progress against the disease, and people should feel, as challenged as people rightfully so feel with all the things they've had to go through for more than a year. I do feel like we are, at the beginning of the end. And now that doesn't mean this virus goes away. We don't know that yet, but I do think it becomes much more manageable. We can go back to hopefully much more normal lives.
Well, Tim, thank you much for your time and the great work of your entire team, really around the world. And we're so glad you're in Covington. We're glad you're in Greater Cincinnati, and continue to do amazing things.
My pleasure, Chris. Thanks for having me.